Good evening. I think it's a few minutes after 7, and I think we're going to get started. My name's Don McDowell. I'm the co-chair of the Iowa Federation of College Republicans. And on behalf of the Iowa State College Republicans and the Committee on Lectures, I'd just like to thank you for coming out tonight. And it's nice to see so many activists. But it's nice to see so many activists and college students out here in Iowa, and we obviously do take our status quite seriously. And so before we get started tonight with our featured guest, I'd just like to plug a few other lectures that are coming up in the near future here, the Committee of Lectures. On April 19, it's the First Amendment. And the guest speaker will be Helen Thomas, journalist, and that will be at 8 p.m. in the Sunroom. Also, there'll be a panel discussion on the hazards of the freedom of the press. That'll be on April 19 as well in the Hoover Hall at 2 p.m., as well as a conversation with Wendell Berry on the 15th of April, coming up closer, at 7 p.m. in the Sunroom next door. And then on the 16th will be Kremlin Rising, Vladimir Putin and the Russian Counter-Revolution with Peter Baker, 6 p.m. Sunroom, again on the 16th. And then if you're looking for a different kind of entertainment, Jodie Sweetin, who was on Full House, the sitcom, for a number of years, will be here on the 16th as well, Great Hall at 8 p.m. So I just want to encourage you to come out to those events. But I'm very honored tonight to introduce our featured guest. Congressman Dr. Ron Paul was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where he was raised and then graduated from Gettysburg College and then from the Duke University School of Medicine. In the 60s, Congressman Paul served in the Air Force as a surgeon before he moved to Texas. It was then that he opened up his medical practice, where he specialized in obstetrics and gynecology, and delivered over 4,000 babies. Dr. Paul and his wife, Carol, are the proud parents of 5 children and 17 grandchildren. A member of Congress from 1976 to 1977, and then from 1979 to 1985, and then again from 1997 to the present, Dr. Paul has been a champion of limited constitutional government, lower taxes, and free markets. In 1976, he was one of 4 members of Congress to endorse Ronald Reagan in his primary challenge to Gerald Ford, and he himself was the 1988 Libertarian Party nominee for president. Congressman Paul is a prolific writer, having penned numerous books, and he officially made his presidential intentions on C-SPAN last month. He presently serves on the House Committee on Financial Services and on the Committee on Foreign Affairs. An unwavering advocate of pro-life and pro-family values, Dr. Paul has consistently voted to lower and abolish federal taxes, slash spending and regulation, and used his House seat to actively promote the return of government to its proper constitutional levels. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving United States Congressman Ron Paul a hearty Iowa State welcome.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here. We had Chamber of Commerce weather today, but I can't say we had it yesterday. But it is real nice to be here, and we're enjoying our visit. I've been here a couple days now. The day before yesterday we arrived. I'll go home tomorrow to Texas. But we have had a good visit here. We've met a lot of people, and a lot of people who are interested in the Constitution, and that pleases me very much. And, of course, that is our subject tonight, to talk about the Constitution. And anybody in politics should care about the Constitution because, when we are sworn in, that's the only oath we take. We don't take an oath to uphold the party platform or any narrow viewpoint that one might hold. We take an oath of office to uphold the Constitution. And I take that very seriously. And unfortunately, I think many, over the many decades, have not taken it seriously. And it's almost, in many ways, have become a dead letter. And that's what I'm concerned about. If you look at our history, we will find that our country was established in a unique sort of way. Because when revolutions break out, historically, the people end up with less freedom. The unusual thing that happened in our revolution is a revolution was fought with good intentions, like most revolutions are, but unlike so many others, the people ended up with more liberty rather than less. And that is what really has provided the incentive for America to become the greatest and the freest and the richest nation ever. And it was the intent to overthrow tyranny and to establish personal liberty and local government. They did not want centralized government. They wanted local government. They never dreamed, the founders never dreamed that they could have perfect government by just making it local. But they believed that solutions were better found when government was made small and spread out, and that the people had more to say about it than the government itself. So I would say that Iowa is a pretty good example of what the founders intended with the concept of caucuses here and letting the people speak out and allowing candidates to come and compete on even terms with others who may have a lot more money. So this really is the type of thing I think the founders were thinking about to allow government to be kept at a local level. But there were certain incentives that drove the founders of the country into their willingness to take on tyranny and use force. Of course, they declared their independence, and then they had to retaliate against the force that the British imposed on them. But the motivation was really to have a say about their lives and control about their lives and taxation. But one of the big issues was the issue of war. They did not like the idea that they would be taxed when a king could wage war and make these declarations. And they were very annoyed that the decision-making power was in the executive branch. At that time, it was the king, to decide whether or not you as a citizen would either be taxed or drafted or sent off to fight foreign wars. And this was one of the things that they were very interested in making explicitly clear in the Constitution. Immediately after the Revolution was won, in the short years following that, before the Constitution was written, it was rather chaotic. The economy was not doing well. We did not have a sound currency, and there were lots of trade barriers between states. So the division was actually a detriment. So the strongest motivation for a constitutional convention was to deal with the monetary issue, as well as the ability of people to go back and forth between the states and trade between the states. And that is, a major achievement. They decided that it was unwise to have a government that could create money out of thin air and inflate a currency, because they had just gone through the experience of the runaway currency of the continental dollar. So there was a prohibition against emitting bills of credit. There was only to be gold and silver to be made legal tender. And they had an interstate commerce clause not to regulate everything that we do between the states, but to deregulate. And the purpose of the Interstate Commerce Clause was not to have prohibitions and tariffs between the states and to allow free trade to really occur. But in its design in the Constitution, if you look at the largest article, it has to do with the Congress. The Congress was to be the most important branch of government. And there were some mandates and some permissions given, but most of it was prohibitions. And if you look to Article 1, Section 8, it really tells you what Congress can do, so indirectly it tells you what the President can do. Because if the Congress can't do it, the President can't write a law anyway. At least they didn't expect the President to write laws. They didn't expect the President to have signing statements. They didn't expect the President to have this arbitrary power to write regulations in the executive branch, which had the force of law. And, of course, they never expected the judicial branch to hear cases they shouldn't be hearing and then write law into the code through the judicial system. None of that was expected. It was to be Congress that wrote the laws. And it was explicitly explained in Article 1, Section 8 on what they could do. And if it wasn't there, they weren't supposed to do it. And some of the important issues, gold and silver was to be legal tender. But also they dealt with the war issue. And the war issue was very important. And they said only Congress can declare war. And they thought that was very, very important. And the people then had more direct control over the members of Congress, especially in the House, that were elected every 2 years. And it was intended that the people, through the members of Congress, would have the ultimate say on whether we would go to war. There was a full debate on this, and there was some concern about what would a president do if the country was attacked, and back then Congress might not be in session. It might be weeks to get them into session. So they said, it was explained, well, it isn't that the president can't declare war. He can make war if necessary, and the understanding was if under attack the president needed to retaliate, he had that authority. But interestingly enough, over these many centuries, the couple centuries plus, there's never been a need for that. We've had time to declare war when we needed to, and we certainly have abused this clause because since World War II, we have fought a lot of wars, we have lost a lot of people, and we have just essentially totally ignored this prohibition that the president can take us to war. We've gone to war to enforce UN resolutions, and we have gone to war because the Congress won't meet their responsibility and make a decision one way or the other. And this last go-around, they literally took this authority and said, we don't want it. We want to wash our hands of it. And I heard even opposition party people say, this is a good trick. They didn't use those words, but essentially, this is a good trick. We can endorse the war and look like we're great patriots and we're willing to fight, but we won't have to make the decision. So if it goes badly, you know who we can blame. And it turned out to be essentially that. The resolution to go to war in Iraq essentially said two things. We were under severe danger by an attack by Saddam Hussein. And we heard all the stories and all the threats and the weapons that we were going to be hit with and all the many reasons why we had to go to war. And the other reason was that it was very important for our security that we enforce and make sure UN resolutions are enforced. So we were enforcing UN resolutions, and we were to make sure that Saddam Hussein would be held in check. Of course, not too many people ask the question, well, could some of this information be false? And there was a lot of information available to me that said it wasn't true at all. We had people from the CIA say that it wasn't true and that there was no real threat, and that if you looked at it, Saddam Hussein didn't have really an army. He had a police guard that protected him. He didn't have a navy. He didn't have an air force. He couldn't shoot down one of our airplanes. We had been flying over his country for 10 years. So there was no evidence of any threat whatsoever. And yet this authority was turned over to the president. So we illegally, unconstitutionally, transferred this authority to the executive branch, allowing the president to make the decision. And if you all remember, during the lead up to the war, the president would say, I haven't decided yet whether or not we're going to have a war. We'll look at this. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. We're going to do this and that. They really and truly had already made a decision, but the argument was, I haven't decided yet, which was annoying to me because I thought only Congress should decide it. Matter of fact, the decision to go to war against Iraq occurred a long time before this administration even took office. The program was designed by the neoconservatives who had a great deal of influence in both Republican and Democratic parties in the mid-1990s. In 1998, with Clinton as president, there was a law passed that he signed into law that said that regime change is the official policy of the United States government. And that became law in 1998. It was at that time that I started speaking out and said, this is the beginning of the war. We shouldn't do it. It doesn't make any sense. And the very first meeting, Clinton did not take us to war, although he did a little bit of bombing over there. He perpetuated the antagonism. But the very first meeting of the new administration in January of 2001, one of the very first discussion, according to Paul O'Neill, was, when are we going to go into Iraq? When are we going to hit Iraq? And he was dumbfounded that the subject was that far along. Right after 9/11, they had a meeting, and the very first thing is, this is, and one individual who was witness to this said there were smiles on their faces because they came in and said, now is our chance, we're going to Iraq. And somebody said, why? Why are we going to Iraq? Well, that was in the plan. That was designated for a long time. And then it had to be waylaid because the evidence was so overwhelming that the attack was by Osama bin Laden, who was held up in Afghanistan. And therefore, there had to be a token effort to go after Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan, which we did, but we didn't pursue him. We chased him over into Pakistan. Pakistan happens to be a country that is a military dictatorship that overthrew an elected government that has nuclear weapons that they got outside of the NPT, and they could present a great threat to us if you're looking for potential threats. And we treat them differently. We treat the Pakistanis differently. We give them your money in the effort of foreign aid, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me, especially now that Osama bin Laden, everybody agrees, is in Pakistan. Of course, on 9/11, it wasn't the Iraqis that attacked us. Most people, well, not most, when we went into Iraq, most people believed it, but very few. But there's still a good many. Well, we are there because they attacked us on 9/11, which is absolutely false. And we know exactly where the people came from. 15 of them came from Saudi Arabia, and some came from Egypt. But there was more justification to go either into Pakistan or Saudi Arabia than it would have been into Iraq. And we got ourselves into a mess. Now, this mess, I believe, has come because we have very little respect for the Constitution. Because if we had forced our leaders to declare war and say, look, this is real, this is dangerous, we have to go to war, then everybody should be behind it. We should fight it, get it over with quickly, and end it, and not drag it out, and not let it be politicized. But they would have no part of it. And the story I tell to emphasize how little respect they have for the Constitution came up during the debates on this resolution. I serve on the International Relations Committee, and the resolution went through the committee. And I wanted to make this point, so I offered a substitute resolution, which was a declaration of war. And I said, we should have an up and down vote on whether or not we want to go to the war. This is what you want to do. You should vote for this. I said, I'm not going to vote for my resolution, so it'll be up to you to defeat this resolution. Of course, everybody on the committee said, we'll have no trouble defeating the resolution. And, of course, everybody voted against it. But the remarks were like this. The chairman of the committee said, well, we understand the gentleman is interested in the Constitution, but that part of the Constitution is no longer applies anymore. It's anachronistic. Those were the words that he used. And somebody else said, well, I don't know why the gentleman's bringing up this. This is just an example of frivolity. This is frivolous to bring the subject up of the Constitution in this day and age because that is so old-fashioned. Well, on a couple of these issues, if it's old-fashioned, there's two things that we can do. We can first ignore the Constitution and do what we want, which is generally what happens. Or we could say, well, times have changed and we no longer really honor the goals and the purposes of the Constitution that were designed for us, and therefore we should change the Constitution. But ignoring the Constitution in small areas means there's nothing left to the Constitution. And that's where we are today. This is the thing that we're giving our young people. A Constitution that doesn't bound down the members of Congress and the executive branch and the judicial branch, because they do what they want. So the contract between the people and the government has essentially been eliminated. It's gone. But there are a few of us who believe that it's very, very important. And if we want to maintain a republic, if we want to maintain our freedoms, this has to be restored. And we're at a crucial point on whether or not we have the respect for law. We have the one issue determined, say, how do we go to war, should we or shouldn't we? But we also have the process, the rule of law, and the Constitution. Both are very, very important, but I think the process might even be more important than the issue itself, because on issues and judgments, people can have their differences. But the rule of law, we should be very precise. And it is in this administration, this has occurred for decades, that we have rejected a strict adherence to the Constitution. Most members of Congress would say, I'm for a strict adherence to the Constitution. I take my oath of office and I take it seriously, but only at certain times. You know, somebody asked me, well, do you have any allies up there? I guess nobody ever agrees with you, because sometimes, or a lot of times, you vote by yourself. I said, you know, it isn't like I never have allies. Everybody's my ally at one time or the other. It's just they're not my allies constantly. When it pleases them, they use the Constitution and say, oh, we shouldn't do this because the Constitution says this. And then on other times, it'll be something else. But for the Constitution to have value, for this contract, which is supposed to hold our government in check, you can't be arbitrary. You can't say, well, sometimes you can use it and sometimes you don't have to. But we're at a point today where we ignore it. The whole welfare ethic, the whole welfare system is not authorized in the Constitution. It's not authorized by the General Welfare Clause. So if you believe that it's important for the federal government to run a welfare state, you ought to change it. You know, there was a time when they had so much respect for the Constitution that they thought it would be best for all of us, of course this was a previous generation, that you not indulge in drinking alcohol. And there could be a pretty good case for not drinking alcohol. A lot of people drink too much, and a lot of people drink and drive and get into trouble and get cirrhosis, and it's bad, it's a lot of expense. All these arguments why you shouldn't drink alcohol. But you know, back then, they didn't just prohibit you from drinking alcohol. They took it and had a constitutional amendment that says you're not going to drink alcohol, which wasn't a very good decision as far as I'm concerned. I think it was wise to caution people, but I also see that as a responsibility myself as a parent and as a grandparent to teach people about the danger of personal choices. But they had a correct analysis. They said, we don't have the authority to do that. We're going to amend the Constitution. Then, lo and behold, 14 years later, they realized this was a joke. This is a problem. They're still drinking alcohol. The alcohol is contaminated. There's a lot of crime and all the reasons why prohibition didn't work. And yeah, they changed it back. But today, if you happen to have a serious disease like cancer or have AIDS and think that marijuana might be helpful to you, and the state legalizes it and tells you that you're allowed, the federal government comes in and they can put you in prison. They can put you in prison for life for being caught with violating a drug law and never have committed violence. Sometimes a nonviolent drug user who's suffering from a disease called addiction can suffer a greater consequence than somebody who has committed rape and murder. And they might serve fewer years and they get out again. And yet we have this thing turned on its head mainly because we don't have respect for the law. And the law is the Constitution. The federal government shouldn't be involved. And the reason this was put in place was when the federal government makes a mistake or the federal courts make a mistake, it has a bearing on all of us. You know, if Texas makes a mistake, you don't suffer, and vice versa. Or if the standards in Massachusetts are different than the standards here, you don't suffer the consequences. But if we allow all these decisions to be made in Washington, whether it's the courts or the Congress or the executive branch, then we all suffer. Maybe they might make a correct decision, but more likely they'll make a bad decision. And then we suffer the consequences. The founders were geniuses in devising a system that provided for the maximum amount of freedom, the minimum amount of government, and they recognized the importance of individual liberty. I have a personal belief and conviction that the most important role of anybody involved in politics is to promote liberty. I just don't think... I don't think for a minute that the purpose of our government should be to make your behavior better and safer for yourself. I can't make you protect you from your own bad judgment. And I don't, as a president, I wouldn't want to do that. I wouldn't intend to do it. I don't have the authority to do it, and it doesn't work. I don't believe I can regulate and make the economy better. The president is not smart enough to do that. But the president should be smart enough to obey the laws to allow you to make your own decisions, protect liberty. And also, if we don't have the right and the authority nor the wisdom to make you better people as individuals in your personal life or the economy better, then we certainly don't have the authority nor the wisdom to tell other people how to live in nation building and policing the world. So we have taken upon ourselves way, way too much, and we have neglected the responsibilities that we have. The government does have some responsibility in providing safety and security in a free society. In a free society, which would be a very productive society, the government's supposed to protect the value of your money. The Constitution says that, and that is wise. It was made a national issue, and it was to not allow the money to be debased, devalued. And yet our government is the counterfeiter. And nobody says anything. Oh, yeah, if you need money, just print it. It won't matter that much. Just the fact that it wipes out poor people in the middle class, and money gravitates to the military-industrial complex and gravitates to the banking system and to Wall Street. Oh, that doesn't matter. We'll just let it go because maybe we'll get some of that cheap money and it'll benefit us because everybody likes easy credit. But it's the rejection of the notion that the government should provide an honest currency, which is so disruptive and so unfair and is really truly a tax. And yet we don't adhere to that prohibition. And but governments have a responsibility to protect property rights for a free society to work. We might not be able to tell you exactly how you should live and what you should do and what your responsibilities are, but if you have a contractual arrangement with your neighbor or your friend or a business arrangement, it should be done freely and openly. And if you have an agreement, you should live up to it. And if you don't, the government has a responsibility. So the government shouldn't be interfering with contracts, but the government is incessantly interfering with contract, telling you whom you can hire and fire and what you can pay them and under what conditions, and all of these things the government comes in, and what they should be protecting is the right of freedom of contract. As a constitutionalist, I see the protection of voluntary relationships between two individuals in a social way the same as the voluntary arrangement in the economic way. Some people in Washington say, I understand this on the social thing. Why get involved in social relationship and sexual relationships and personal habits because we don't want the government in our bedroom? And they understand that very clearly. And they understand the issue. Yes, you should be allowed to gamble and indulge and do these things, assume the responsibility. But then they turn around and they say, but we can't allow that in the economic sphere because it might not be fair to everybody. There might not be perfect redistribution of wealth. Not realizing that it's the free society, the productive society, the incentive society that produces the greatest amount of wealth and the best distribution. That's what the freedom that we've had has demonstrated. The less free a country is, the poorer the country is and the worse the distribution. We are moving away from the market economy, and here we have the middle class being wiped out, jobs being lost, jobs going overseas, inflation eating away at the income of the middle class. At the same time, we have Wall Street firms passing out $16 billion in bonuses. And I, as a free market person, have nothing against big corporations making a lot of money as long as they earn it by the vote of the consumer. You know, if Bill Gates makes a lot of money because you buy his product and he doesn't get subsidies and protection from the government, I have no qualms with that. Besides, you know, if he's big and rich because he's free and he gives us a good service, what's he going to do with his money? He's going to have so much he'll probably have to end up giving it away, which he's doing. So we shouldn't sit around worrying about that. What we should worry about are the people who want to get rich because they're in bed with the government. Whether it's through the inflationary system and Wall Street and the bankers benefiting and the military-industrial complex benefiting and the Halliburtons of the world benefiting by getting all these contracts. Now that's corporatism, and that's completely different. That's completely different from free market capitalism where people become wealthy because they are voted that wealth because the consumer buys their product. That's quite a bit different. And that's what the government should protect. It's these voluntary arrangements, whether they're social or economic. And this is very clear in the Constitution that we don't have a system of government of collectivism. Rights, according to the founders, and it was made very clear that rights should only be held by individuals. I see the whole world in terms of individuals. I don't see collective rights. I don't think the rights of women are different than the rights of men. I don't believe there's such a thing as women rights or minority rights or gay rights or anything like that. Everybody has a right to their life and to their liberty, and they ought to be left alone. The magnificence of the Constitution, if you read it and study it, is you realize that the many problems that we have today is the failure to follow the guideline, follow the rule of law. We abandoned it on the war declaration, the war powers. We abandoned it on the monetary system. We abandoned it on property rights, and we just desert the concept that government should be local. Likewise, all the problems that we have can be solved by looking to the Constitution and the advice of the founders. I can't say all because I don't claim it's a perfect document, but it was and is the best. We're in trouble today because we neglect it. We're in a mess overseas. We've dug holes for ourselves financially here at home and financially abroad. And the young people, the next generation, many of whom are here tonight, are going to inherit a system which is essentially non-functioning. It is only functioning today on a temporary basis because we have still maintained a trust in our dollar where the world is still willing to take our paper money. They take it as if it were gold because it used to be tied to gold. But they haven't realized since 1971 it has not been, but still they'll take our gold, but they're taking it, they'll take our paper. But every single day they're taking it a little less enthusiastically. Right now, even in this past week, a lot less enthusiastically, and the dollar drops in value. Prices are going up. Prices of imports just last month went up 1.7%. That's huge. That's 18% increases in prices. What we have done recently is actually worse than what was done in the 1960s. Back in the 60s when I was in the military, LBJ said, we can have guns and butter. We can fight the Vietnam War. Deficits don't matter, and we can have new entitlements. And that, of course, is when they introduced the Medicare and the entitlements. And what have we done again? We have guns and butter and new entitlements. Deficits don't matter. And that's not coming from the liberals. Our supply-siders who advocated, they came in and said, oh, deficits really don't matter. Just lower the tax rate and we will have economic growth and we will pay for our government. Well, if you don't believe in big government, you don't want to lower taxes so government can grow. If you can lower taxes, that's fine with me, but it should be with cutting spending. with the full belief and conviction that people will be better off in a free society. I am so convinced that economically there will be more people better off than if you have a government that's always trying to redistribute and control the wealth. Because once the government gets that power to do that, even assuming that they got this power with good intention, eventually the special interests gain control. And this is why you see a presidential race today that is going to cost $1 billion. And they're buying at the auction because they know there is so much to be auctioned off. And we have, and is it Republican or Democrat? I think it's bipartisan. And when you look at it, how about the influence of the drug companies on the Republican Party when it comes to medical prescription drug programs and managed care? Billions of dollars now. It's supposed to go to medicine, but it goes to the management companies. It goes to the drug companies, and yet the corporations have a lot of stake, and there's a lot of money that's interested in the military-industrial complex. When we were making a decision to go into Colombia, guess who was lobbying for us to have more foreign aid and get involved militarily in Colombia? To stop the drugs, of course. That was the pretext of going to Colombia. But it was the helicopter companies and the oil companies that had, like Occidental, they were interested in us going down there. This is what happens when government gets big, regardless of what the reason is. If you don't follow the Constitution, it gets out of control and money controls it. And then who gets blamed? Capitalism and freedom and the marketplaces. Even the Depression was blamed on the gold standard and the market economy. It was never blamed on the Federal Reserve. And yet it was the Federal Reserve that caused a boom in the 20s and the bust of the 30s. Free markets do not create depressions like we had in the 30s. Yet erroneously, free markets and sound money were blamed, and that was incorrect. And even today, it's going to be very tempting because it's easy to attack the corporations, which I do, but I struggle to distinguish the difference between honestly earned money and accumulation of wealth versus being in collusion with the government and getting these special benefits. But so many of these solutions can come by just looking to the rule of law and deciding what we can do and can't do. If we want to change some of these things, if you think that it's a good idea for the federal government to run your schools, they do not have the authority to do it. From my viewpoint, my political viewpoint, and my personal viewpoint is they shouldn't. I think you can do a good enough job here than sending all your money over to Washington, hoping to get some of it back without regulation. Instead, you send it over, you get less back, and you get no child left behind telling you what to do. And I think it'd be better you took care of your own schools here in Iowa. But unlike what they did with the prohibition of alcohol, we now have education dominated in Washington, and we have central economic planning without changing the Constitution. There's very, very little respect for the Constitution, just as I demonstrated when we had the debate on the war resolution. They would just as soon say that it is just a nuisance to us, and it should be ignored. But without the rule of law, you have the rule of politicians. And if you look at it in each area, the market is less free. We are less prosperous. We do not have the manufacturing jobs as we used to have. We are greatly in debt. We are depending on borrowing nearly $3 billion a day from the Chinese to finance our war. And so we are pretending to be wealthy. And if you went out and borrowed $1 million a month for several months, you could look very wealthy, but eventually you'd have to pay it back. And now we're moving into the age where we will be paying back. We cannot pay for the entitlements. The young people in this room can't take care of the people who are already retired and who are going to retire. They can't work enough. If they gave up 90% of their salaries, they can't work hard enough to take care of the entitlement commitments. So there will be a failure. And the failure will probably come with the dollar. The dollar will fail because the only thing they can do in Washington is resort to printing money. Because they can't tax anymore, there's going to be a limit to the borrowing. There's going to be a rejection of loaning to us endlessly at these low interest rates. And the government will say, well, we have to do something. They'll say, well, prices are so high, we don't have enough money. But the problem is the prices were high because there was too much money circulating. But they will resort to inflation and inflating the currency, which leads to the higher prices. So this is very, very dangerous, because if we see that our freedoms are threatened today, they will be even more threatened. In times of war, whether it's a hot war like we have in Iraq, or a war against terrorism, a war against drugs, these are the times when people are more willing to say, oh, well, this is a time of war, we have to give up a little bit of our freedoms. And that is an attitude that is competing with those individuals, like many in this room, are saying, yes, I understand what they're saying, but I do not believe that I have to sacrifice my liberty to be safer. And that is what I believe. There are some who claim that you can give up your economic liberties, but they do not want to give up the personal civil liberties. I say and argue the case that they are one and the same. Today, our civil liberties are being severely challenged. We have national ID cards with the real ID. We have the government's ability now, or at least the technical legality and the authority to know everything about you. They are allowed to spy on you without warrants. They are allowed to hold American citizens now without due process. And this is continuous, and it's the atmosphere that has come out of 9/11. Well, anything that will make me safer, I'm willing to do it. Versus the others who would say, no, we don't want to give up our liberties. The purpose of a government is to protect our liberties. And I am absolutely convinced that the freer we are, the safer we are. So I don't ever have to make this choice about sacrificing some of our civil liberties and due process in court, thinking that I am going to be safer. But we are undermining our personal liberties, our rights in our courts. We are undermining our privacy. At the same time, we have enhanced the ability of governments to be secret. I, as a president, would do everything conceivable to make government more open, not work towards secrecy, emphasizing only that on a rare time with some information for national security reasons might be necessary. There is probably room for that. But that's not what's going on in this country. The goal of government today is protecting government secrecy and undermining your privacy. It should be reversed. We should have government openness with a government protecting your privacy. You know, the basic understanding of constitutional liberty and the protection of our rights comes from a basic notion, I believe, on where our rights and our lives come from. My personal opinion is my life comes from a creator, and that my creator created my life, and also my right to my life, and the responsibility for my life, and a responsibility not to hurt other people. Others might not want to use those same terms, and they might call it a natural right. And they are very, very similar, that you are born with a natural right to be left alone. But you're also born with a responsibility to take care of yourselves and take care of your families and your children and raise your families and make these decisions, and not allow these decisions to be made in Washington or by government. Because every time government makes an economic or a personal decision or an international decision, it's always at the expense of personal liberty. And whether it's the extraction of money from your pocketbook or the use of you as an individual to police the world. The two issues that I think demonstrate so clearly that we have lost that, because there's the economic attack on your personal right, is the idea of the income tax. The income tax means that it perpetuates the thought that the government owns every bit of your income, and they'll allow you to keep a certain percentage. So even if you had a 1% tax on your income, it means the government allowed you to keep 1% of your income. So the notion that there is to be a tax on your income sort of confirms the fact that the government and big government people would like to believe that they own your life and they own everything you earn. The other thing that confers ownership by government on our lives is the concept of the draft, the military draft. We don't have a military draft today, but I think it's possible it'll come. Attitudes are opposed to it right now. We had a bad experience with it in the 60s, and they claim that it will never happen. But today they had to extend tours of duty of 100,000 of our military. Nobody wants to join up anymore, and older people are joining. It's a real mess. We're in a bad shape for our defense. But they never got rid of the selective service. Since the 70s, since we got rid of the draft, and ever since I've been in Congress, I'm always offering a bill to get rid of selective service. And besides, I think it was a time a while ago, didn't we outlaw involuntary servitude? And I think it's very important that we eventually get rid of selective service and never have the draft. If this country is truly attacked, I believe that a free society, and especially us as Americans, would defend this country, and we would volunteer no matter what our age was and no matter what the sex was. I think we would be all willing to. But that's not what's happening today. And when, rather than if, it's more likely when this war spreads in the Middle East, unless we have a change in policy and start bringing our troops home, I would say that when it spreads into Iran and they attack and kill a lot of Americans, the American public will be outraged and they will want to retaliate. And they say, well, we don't have the troops. Well, you better draft them. Besides, that's equal to distribution of penalties. There are some people in Washington promoting the draft because they would like to see equal distribution of the injury, just not on volunteers, but on everybody. And that's their idea of equality. Well, that's not my idea of equality. My idea of equality is to let you make up your own mind about what you want to do with your own life, and that you assume responsibility for yourselves. So the times that we live in are precarious. I believe they are financially precarious because of the threat to the dollar and our economic system. But we also live in very good times. We live in good times today compared to 30 or 40 years ago, because the information dealing with this very subject was not well talked about. The availability of ideas on liberty spread now like wildfire over the internet. When I first studied these principles, it was hard to find literature. There were very few organizations that promoted these ideas, and we didn't talk about the Constitution. Today, there's a growing number of people, growing by leaps and bounds, much further ahead outside of Washington than that they are. The American people are much further ahead in Congress on this war. They're sick and tired of the war. They'd like us to come home, and that's what I think we ought to do. We ought to come home as soon as possible. But the opportunities we have are outstanding, whether it's in the campaign or whether it's the spread of ideas. The internet is magnificent. This is why I vote tenaciously against any regulation whatsoever on the internet, which politically can get me into a little bit of trouble, because some people would like to do you a service and to make sure you don't read anything on the internet that might be harmful to you. And there might be some pictures on there that you shouldn't see, assuming the government should be the policeman. I vote against all regulation and taxation of the internet because it's a dangerous move. It's the greatest free market mechanism of transferring information ever known to man. And it can be very useful in a campaign. The special interests will have a lot of money and a lot of influence, but campaigns can be run and help immensely with the internet. Raising money, raising necessary funds, as well as finding allies and supporters. And this is available, which has each year become more available to us. And of course, this is very annoying to those who have a lot of money. And this is the reason you see the move away from the caucus system in the early primary in New Hampshire, because lo and behold, they surely wouldn't want an independent candidate to have a voice. What they want is to have all the primaries at the same time, and you better have $50 to $75 or $100 million in the bank. This is estimated to be a $1 billion campaign that's coming up. They want us to be able to run in California, New York, and Florida, and Texas all at one time to make sure that Iowa has no say. I think that that is the wrong direction, and that we should maintain this ability of candidates who are independent-minded, who will come and tell you the truth and visit with individuals and maybe make a mark and have representation and do well in a state like Iowa. To me, that is very, very important. But money is the name of the game, and unfortunately, we are moving in that direction. So we have a great task ahead, which means the organization to overcome that, because it's not like the next go-around. It might be this go-around that they'll be able to change it, where all the big elections will occur in January and February right at the same time as the caucus or the New Hampshire primary. I think that is a bad move. I think that we certainly ought to work and strive to allow the people to speak out and allow independent candidates to have a voice. In the 1970s, there was not much knowledge about the true purpose of this government and our country, and the true purpose of individual liberty. It's much better known today. There's reason for me to be very optimistic. There is a change going on, and yet I don't know exactly what tomorrow will bring, next month will bring, or the next election will bring. But I know that we are moving in the right direction, but it does take determination and a lot of work and effort. And we can't just sit back and say, oh, it will work out. You're concerned about the economy. It is fictitious. The war will soon end over there. The Iranians would never attack us. And besides, this attack on our civil liberties is not real. Most of us are still free, and we don't have to worry about being incarcerated without due process and be complacent. I say this is the time to be active, to be involved. And I want to close by thanking you very much for this opportunity, and to invite you to help me in any way possible to promote the cause of liberty. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. I think there's a little bit of time left. I was told that we could take some questions. So I will take some questions. Please shout them out as loud as you can to make sure I can hear them and that the other people can hear them as well. Is there somebody that would like to ask a question? Here we go.
Yes, sir. I understand that you ran for president in 1988 as a libertarian. Are you still a libertarian at heart?
I'm a strict constitutionalist. I believe the founders were libertarians, and I believe the Constitution is a very libertarian document. I joined the Libertarian Party in 1987, and I became a lifetime member, and I have not rejected it. I've never run for Congress other than as a Republican. I was a Republican in the 70s and early 80s. I went home, and that was when I participated with the Libertarian Party for a year. And then after 12 years, I went back into the Congress as a Republican. Once again, I think one thing a state could do, if there's a lot of influential people in this room, to talk to your legislature, and I don't even know what your law is, but individuals ought to be allowed to run on two ballots. You know, if you're a liberal Democrat and you want to run as a greenie and a Democrat, I think that should be permissible. In New York, you can run as a conservative and a Republican, a liberal and a Democrat. But in most states, you're not allowed. And this would help identify your views. It's very, very difficult. All the laws are biased against third parties, and it's hard to run in a third party because it's difficult to get on ballots. So I would say it'd be good to allow an individual, and I would run for Congress as both a libertarian and a Republican, and I'm not embarrassed by it. I don't endorse everything on the Libertarian Party platform. I didn't even in 1988 when I ran. I happen to be a right-to-life libertarian. I believe in the sanctity of life, but I believe believe it should be enforced at the state level, and we don't need federal laws dealing with it. But I'm for repealing Roe versus Wade and allowing the states to make these determinations. So I had disagreements with him, but it doesn't matter whether or not I volunteer the label libertarian. It comes up every single time and in every article in Texas. So it really hasn't hurt me politically. And they tried to hurt me with it on the drug issue. But I expressed myself on the drug issue because I think the drug war has been a failure. And I live in the Bible Belt. It's very Christian, very conservative, a lot of homeschoolers. And it never hurt me. So I think the people are way ahead of the U.S. Congress on the ill effects of the drug war. But I think one thing you have to convince, and I as a parent and as a grandparent, as a physician, I think I convinced my district that I don't like the drugs. I think they're very dangerous, but I think it's your personal choice if some people want to hurt themselves. But I also point out that prescription drugs are probably a lot more dangerous and a lot more harm done by the illegal drugs. In the back, and make it loud.
Here from Texas, and I've heard that the NAFTA superhighway is being built in Texas now, which is going to be North American Union, and what I understand is that the whole projection is that Canada, United States, and Mexico, they would like them to be one country, one currency. What do you figure that?
Right. He's talking about the consequence of some of the concerns that many of us expressed when they passed NAFTA. NAFTA was supposed to be all about free trade. It was a little bit about free trade, but it was more about international government and managed trade for the benefit of certain companies. So I was opposed to NAFTA, and as many of us predicted, it has led to the next stage, and that's the SPP, the Security and Prosperity Project, and one of the things that they are planning is a highway from Mexico all the way to Canada. First time Mexican trucks will have to stop is in Kansas City, and it's very real. Our Texas governor is moving it along. There's been some small appropriations already in the U.S. Congress. The people outside of Washington are much more concerned and know about it. They realize how many millions of acres will be taken under eminent domain, and what it will do with the concept of breaking down our borders and making the illegal immigration problem actually worse. I think it's very real, but I'm opposed to big government in Washington, so I'm certainly opposed to big government over and above the government in Washington, whether it's a NAFTA-type government or the UN or any of these organizations. And yet I am not opposed to trade. Matter of fact, I'm not an isolationist and I'm not a protectionist. I would like honest, free trade with as many people who are willing. I think the trade that we have with Vietnam should have been tried before we fought them. We fought and killed a lot of them, and they killed a lot of us. And now what are we doing? We're trading with Vietnam. That's what we should have been doing with Cuba a long time ago. And I think Castro would have been taken out a long time ago because they would have seen the benefits instead of using us as the reason to maintain power with the dictatorship. But no, I don't like that movement. I don't want to see a North American Union, and yet I would like to see us friends with our neighbors and trading with our neighbors. But I don't think we should have illegal immigration. I don't think we should have amnesty. I don't think we should have birthright citizenship. And I don't think you should ever be forced to pay for the health care or the education of illegal aliens. Okay, you wanted me to explain the Federal Reserve a little bit. I mentioned it because I talked about the currency itself. But the Federal Reserve is a central bank. There's no authority in the Constitution to establish a central bank, so it's unconstitutional. But the Federal Reserve has been created by government, but it's very secretive and in many ways very private. And the Congress has no, although we get to talk and quiz Bernanke and Greenspan, and I have many times over the years, we have no real jurisdiction. We don't have true oversight. We can't have an audit of the Federal Reserve. But the main reason why they're so important is because they can create money out of thin air. They have been given the monopoly control over money and credit. And it benefits not only the politicians who like to spend money, but it also benefits the bankers who get to expand that money and credit through fractional reserve banking. But it is this power that distorts markets. The most important part of a market economy is to have a pricing structure. Von Mises, the great Austrian economist, predicted that socialism and communism would fail because they don't have a pricing mechanism, and he was correct. Communism fell apart, and it didn't work, and we didn't need to fight a war with them. But the same way, if you manipulate money and credit and the price of money, which is the interest rates, you will cause distortions. There, for a while in the early part of this decade, they had overnight rates for bankers down at 1%. And they've been drastically low, and they have caused a tremendous boom to the economy. And once all the money went into the stock market, there was a stock market crash. And you know, the stock market, the NASDAQ is only half or less than half of what it used to be. The Dow, in real terms, is about where it was in the year 2000. That's all a result of the Federal Reserve causing a boom and then a bust. And then all of a sudden they were able to translate that boom attitude by pumping money into the housing industry. Well, the prices went up and everybody bought a house, but now there's the liquidation. The people who have houses and can't afford it, and that is the question. That's all due to the Federal Reserve. But the Federal Reserve is very mischievous. They're very detrimental to the economy. But more importantly is, I think it's an immoral act to allow our governments to counterfeit money and the Federal Reserve. It's wrong to allow it because it's not constitutional. But one of the worst aspects of the Federal Reserve, it allows governments to grow and do things that they're not authorized. Just think of what it would be like that if each and every one of us would have to pay our tax bill to pay for all the government that we get. If we had to do that every single month for the war and for the entitlement, we would rebel. And yet what happens now is we can borrow the money and pass the debt on to the next generation, and also we can pass this invisible